Good evening, and welcome back to the Poe Museum. I appear to have gotten myself stuck up the chimney again, but while I try to find my way out of this predicament, why don't you enjoy another episode of the Curator's Crypt? Welcome to the Poe Museum's Curator's Crypt. It's said that at the time of Edgar Allan Poe's death, most of his worldly possessions were contained in this trunk. Now, this is the trunk that Poe would have used while he was traveling up and down the East Coast, performing. This is when Poe really reached the height of his stardom. The Raven made him a household name. He was Edgar the Raven Poe. Little kids would recognize him on the street, follow him around saying, "Nevermore, nevermore." He'd flap his arms like a big raven, and he was giving sold-out performances in Boston, New York, up and down the East Coast. It's said that no matter what Poe read, people wanted to hear his greatest hit, The Raven. They'd start walking out if they thought he wasn't going to read The Raven. And when he did, the audience was spellbound. This is how Poe made a lot of the money in the last few years of his life. He didn't really have anything tying him back home since his wife had died, and he just wanted to sell magazine subscriptions and start his own magazine. The way to do that was to drum up publicity through these lecture tours and through these poetry readings. We know that he very often was struggling to make a living. It was kind of a hand-to-mouth existence, traveling by stagecoach or train. It couldn't have been an easy life for him. Sure, he was celebrated wherever he went. People applauded him. But he just wasn't seeing quite the financial reward that he thought he deserved. But when we look at the trunk, you see it's actually a pretty nice piece, probably made in Boston or New York in the late 1840s. It's covered with these beautiful little brass knobs. It's a style called a gold rush trunk, which was typical of right about 1849, the year of Poe's death. So he's trying to portray himself as a wealthy man, and we know the kind of clothes he wore were also the finest clothes he could afford. Even if they're years old, he'd make sure he wore those things until they're about to fall off, and he couldn't always afford new clothes. But he made sure the clothes he had were the most fashionable, most expensive, so he could portray himself as a wealthy Southern gentleman that he kind of believed he was. The first reference we have to this trunk is a letter that Poe wrote on August 29th, 1849. He's in Richmond, Virginia. It's a little bit over a month before his death on October 7th in Baltimore. He's just delivered a successful lecture at the Exchange Hotel, one of the classiest hotels in town. He still can't afford to stay there, so he's been spending his nights at the Swan Tavern a few blocks away. As he writes to his mother-in-law, "I lectured here last Friday week and had a crowded house, 250 persons. But like a fool, I put the tickets at 25 cents. The room cost $10, printing bills, etc., $5, and doorkeeper $1. I got about $25 clear of all expense, but my bill to Swan took it all, and much more. I could not get my trunk without paying some $25. I still owe $13.50. So the hotel confiscated Poe's trunk because he hadn't been able to pay his hotel bill. And that's when he moved to cheaper quarters at the Madison House down on Main Street. The next reference we have to a Poe trunk is shortly before his departure from Richmond. It's said that his sister, Rosalie Poe, was overseeing the moving of his trunk out of her house when it knocked over a lamp and broke a lamp. And the family was upset. What are we going to do? We broke this lamp. And Rosalie says, oh, you should be honored. Your lamp was broken by a poet's trunk. So from there, we can only speculate Poe left with or without his trunk and turned up in Baltimore. Semi-conscious, dressed in somebody else's clothes at a polling place on a voting day. And I've already told this story in previous episodes of the Curator's Crypt. But we know that one of the first things his doctor, John Moran, asked him when he got to the hospital was, where's your trunk? Where are your clothes? And Poe didn't have a clue. And while he was in the hospital, he never told him quite where his trunk was, what had become of it. It wasn't until after his death that there was really a search for it. Now, everybody wanted it. Of course, Poe's mother-in-law wanted the trunk. She wanted to have a complete edition of Poe's works published. This would be all the short stories, all the poems taken from every different newspaper and magazine that ever printed them, all published in one place. And to get the latest author-authorized versions of each work, she needed to get his manuscripts whenever possible and give them to his new literary executor, the editor of the complete works of Edgar Allan Poe. You guessed it, Rufus W. Griswold, Poe's worst enemy. You can also learn about that on an earlier episode of the Curator's Crypt. So Griswold acted as her attorney and went searching for that trunk. Meanwhile, Rosalie Poe, Edgar's sister, she thought that Poe had given her the trunk, that she deserved the poet's trunk, so she enlisted the help of the Southern Literary Messenger's editor, John Reuben Thompson, to act as her lawyer, and Poe's mother-in-law and sister fought over who had the rights to have the trunk. But where was it? Well, apparently, Poe's cousin, Nelson, who Edgar had previously called his worst enemy in the world, he found the trunk. It looks like either he found it or the doctor found it, either at the train depot in Baltimore or at a hotel across the street. But it turned up, Nelson got a hold of it and wouldn't let go. But Rosalie still wanted that trunk, and so did Poe's mother-in-law, Maria Clemm. So they started going after Nelson Poe to get the trunk back. Thompson wrote to Nelson Poe saying that Poe's sister is his sole legitimate heir and needs the trunk. As soon as Maria Clemm found out that Nelson had the trunk, she wrote to him saying, I enclose to you 2 of my dear son's letters. She's referring to Edgar there. And you can judge who has a better right to anything of his, Rose or myself. What right has Rose to anything belonging to him? He has not even written to her in more than 2 years. And she has never done anything for him except to speak ill of him. My friends are most indignant at her request. It looks like Maria Clemm might be lying a bit. If Poe had a fan club, Rosalie Poe would be the president. She adored her brother, she looked out for him, even went up to New York and visited him all the way from Richmond. When he gave his reading, she was sure to be in attendance. And it's even said when he gave a private reading at a nearby Richmond home, she showed up at the reading and sat in his lap after he'd finished The Raven. She definitely was devoted to her brother, and I can't imagine she was speaking ill of it. This is Maria Clemm trying to manipulate people to get what she wants. Now, after Nelson didn't write back to Maria, she wrote to Dr. Moran. What I wish you to do for me, dear sir, is to inquire for me of Mr. N. Poe, why he retains the trunk, and why he will not let me have those papers. If I learn that he has them not, the third volume of Griswold's book will have to be published without them. At all events, procure from him my darling Eddie's letters to myself and enclose them to me, for they are 1,000 times more precious to me than rubies. So apparently she still didn't have the trunk, but she heard that Rosalie had it. She wrote to Rufus Griswold, indignant, saying, "I cannot understand this and wish you to let me know if there's any truth to it." Apparently she was misinformed, because at the same time Rosalie Poe wrote to Griswold, "I think and do say that I have been unjustly treated since his death. His trunk is taken from me, which he gave to me himself. If Mr. Poe of Baltimore has it, and will not give it to me until I administer for it." So it looks like Nelson Poe has the trunk, but Rosalie's saying that he took it from her. So does that mean the trunk wasn't originally in Baltimore? Well, about 50 years later, an account from Poe's friend and physician John Carter said that Poe left his trunk at the Swan Tavern back in Richmond. So maybe Rosalie did go there, pay off his hotel bill, and pick up his trunk. But who would have sent it to Nelson Poe? Now, Nelson Poe didn't end up with the trunk. It looks like Rosalie, who was a school teacher in Richmond, still living with her wealthy foster family, was able to afford to get the trunk back from Nelson. She kept it for most of the rest of her life, until the final years she left it with her foster niece in Matthews County, Virginia. Her daughter eventually sold to the museum for $25, plus 25 cents postage. When the museum opened back in 1922, Poe's trunk was one of the star attractions. By this time, pretty much everything had been taken out of it except for Poe's mirror, which is still on display today, and it's frequently said that this was actually Poe's wife's mirror. She had died just a couple years before he did, and never able to let go of her entirely, he had their two wedding rings fused together into one large ring. And it looks like he might have also kept her mirror and carried it with him when he traveled around the country. What happened to everything else that was in the trunk? Where did it all go? We know that Rufus Griswold got a lot of the pieces. Some of them came by way of Griswold's grandchildren to the Poe Museum, where you can still see them today. Other pieces, we can only speculate what happened to them. When the Poe Museum reopens, you'll have the opportunity to see this priceless artifact in person and see what mysteries it still contains. Well, thanks for joining me this week. And if you'd like to avoid getting stuck up a chimney, be sure to find out how by reading Poe's story, The Murders in the Rue Morgue, which you can purchase in one of these deluxe editions in the Poe Museum's gift shop at poemuseum.org/museum-store.